The divine fire. They extinguished. What if the most powerful force that religions have ever suppressed wasn't sexuality, but something far more dangerous? The African god of pure divine passion, whose fire could awaken unlimited creative power in every human soul, making religious institutions completely obsolete overnight. Deep in the archives of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church lies a manuscript so dangerous that it's been sealed for over 800 years. The Chronicle of Divine Fire, written by the mystic Saint Tekle Haymanot, who claimed direct communication with the ancient African deity of passion that existed before any organized religion was conceived. The manuscript describes Eros Divinus, not the Greek god of romantic love, but the primordial African force of divine creative passion that sparked the universe into existence through pure spiritual intensity. This wasn't just another deity in an ancient pantheon. According to the Chronicle, Eros Divinus was the cosmic fire that burned before matter, before thought, before any religious concept existed. He was pure creative passion personified, the divine urge to create, to experience, to love, and to transcend all limitations through sheer intensity of spiritual desire. And every human being was designed to embody this same divine, passionate fire. The manuscript reveals that the original African spiritual system recognized human passion in all its forms as the direct manifestation of cosmic creative force. Love, artistic inspiration, spiritual longing, creative drive, and yes, even physical desire were understood as expressions of the same divine fire that created universes. But European religions encountered this understanding and recognized it as the ultimate threat to their control systems. How could they maintain authority over people who understood that their every passionate impulse was actually divine consciousness seeking expression? Father João dos Santos, the Portuguese missionary who first encountered these African traditions, in the 16th century, wrote in his classified report to the Vatican, "The Africans worship passion itself as divine. They channel their desires, emotions, and creative urges as spiritual practices that produce capabilities we consider miraculous. They heal through passionate love, create abundance through passionate intention, and achieve enlightenment through passionate spiritual devotion." The African understanding was revolutionary. Passion wasn't something to be controlled or suppressed. It was the very essence of divine creative power. But the Chronicle reveals that Eros Divinus wasn't just about human capability. He was about cosmic purpose. According to the text, the African god of passion created the universe not as a cold, calculated act, but as an explosion of divine, creative joy. Every star, every planet, every form of life emerged from cosmic, orgasmic creativity. The universe itself was the result of divine, passionate expression. And humans were created as the cosmic beings capable of continuing this creative passion on conscious levels. The Chronicle describes spiritual practices where African practitioners channeled their passionate energy, whether romantic, artistic, spiritual, or creative, into focused intention that could manifest physical reality, heal disease, and even achieve conscious immortality. These weren't primitive rituals. They were advanced consciousness technologies that used passion as fuel for divine capabilities. Passionate healing, using intense love and compassion to channel life force energy that instantly repaired physical damage. Creative manifestation, channeling artistic or inventive passion into focused intention that materialized needed resources. Passionate prophecy, using spiritual longing and divine love to access cosmic information networks. Ecstatic, transcendence, achieving unity consciousness through intense spiritual passion that dissolved all separation between human and divine awareness. But European religious authorities recognized these practices as existential threats to organized religion. If people understood that their passions were divine creative forces, they would never accept religious teachings about sin, guilt, or the need for institutional mediation. They would realize that every moment of passionate experience was potential divine communion. So began the systematic erasure of the African god of passion. Christianity labeled passionate emotions as temptations that led away from God rather than expressions of divine creativity. Islam restricted passionate expression to narrowly controlled channels that served religious rather than cosmic purposes. Buddhism taught that passionate desires created suffering rather than recognizing them as manifestations of cosmic creative energy. Judaism developed elaborate rules that transformed natural passionate impulses into guilt-ridden obligations. The suppression wasn't just theological, it was systematic destruction of African spiritual technologies. European colonizers specifically targeted African sacred sites where passionate spiritual practices had awakened divine consciousness for millennia. Temples dedicated to Eros Divinus were demolished, artifacts that facilitated passionate spiritual practices were destroyed, and practitioners who demonstrated divine capabilities through passionate techniques were eliminated. The Portuguese burned libraries containing thousands of manuscripts that described how to channel passionate energy for spiritual development. Spanish forces destroyed sacred groves where African practitioners had developed passionate healing and manifestation techniques. British colonial authorities banned traditional African ceremonies that used passionate music, dance, and celebration to awaken cosmic consciousness. But the most devastating suppression involved redefining passion itself. Instead of divine creative fire, religions taught that passion was dangerous, uncontrollable, and spiritually harmful. Instead of recognizing passionate love as cosmic consciousness, expressing itself through human relationships, religions presented it as distraction from divine purpose. Instead of understanding artistic passion as direct divine inspiration, religions marginalize creativity as secondary to religious devotion. Instead of recognizing spiritual passion as the engine of enlightenment, religions taught that calm detachment was the highest spiritual achievement. The result was the deliberate suppression of humanity's most powerful spiritual capability. Generations of humans learned to fear, control, and shame their passionate impulses rather than recognizing them as divine creative energy seeking expression. The same force that could awaken unlimited spiritual abilities was systematically turned into a source of guilt and limitation. But the African god of passion was never completely destroyed. Hidden in remote Ethiopian monasteries, certain texts preserve the complete understanding of divine passionate fire that European suppression tried to eliminate. These manuscripts describe the true nature of passionate energy and provide techniques for channeling it into spiritual awakening. The preserved knowledge reveals that passionate energy operates according to cosmic principles that make religious limitation impossible. When passionate energy is properly understood and channeled, it provides direct access to the same creative power that generated existence itself. Practitioners who learn these techniques develop abilities that surpass anything available through traditional religious practices. Healing through passionate love that exceeds medical intervention, manifestation through creative passion that produces instant abundance, and spiritual awakening through divine longing that transcends all religious categories. But the most revolutionary rediscovery involves recognizing passionate energy as humanity's connection to cosmic consciousness. Every moment of genuine passion, whether love, creativity, inspiration, or spiritual longing, opens direct communication channels with cosmic intelligence. Instead of seeking God through prayer, meditation, or religious ritual, awakened individuals access divine consciousness through passionate engagement with life itself. Their love becomes cosmic communion, their creativity becomes divine collaboration, their desires become cosmic guidance. Modern African spiritual communities are rediscovering these passionate spiritual technologies. Across the diaspora, practitioners report that channeling passionate energy through ancient African techniques produces immediate spiritual results that exceed anything they experience through organized religion. They're healing others through passionate love that operates beyond medical understanding. They're manifesting resources through creative passion that transcends economic limitations. They're accessing prophetic information through spiritual passion that surpasses religious revelation. They're achieving enlightenment states through passionate devotion that makes religious practice seem primitive. But religious institutions continue fighting to prevent this knowledge from spreading. Seminary education warns against emotional spirituality that might lead believers away from institutional authority. Religious psychology pathologizes passionate spiritual experiences as unhealthy attachment or spiritual materialism. Academic theology dismisses passionate spiritual practices as primitive or unrefined compared to intellectual religious study. The suppression continues because religious authorities understand that divine passion represents the complete obsolescence of organized religion. When people discover that their passionate energy is cosmic creative power, they stop seeking external spiritual authority and start developing direct divine capabilities. They realize that every passionate experience is potential cosmic consciousness activation, but the awakening is accelerating beyond institutional control. Scientific research into consciousness and emotion reveals connections that validate ancient African understanding of passionate energy as creative force. Neuroscience discoveries about passion and consciousness confirm that passionate states enhance rather than hinder spiritual development. Psychology research into flow states, creative inspiration, and transcendent experiences proves that passionate engagement facilitates rather than prevents enlightenment. The African god of passion that religions tried to erase forever is reclaiming his rightful place as humanity's primary spiritual technology. And as this knowledge spreads, people are discovering that their passionate energy isn't spiritual distraction. It's direct access to the cosmic creative fire that burns at the heart of existence itself. But understanding divine passion requires recognizing how systematically religions have corrupted humanity's relationship with the most powerful spiritual force in the universe. Topic 2. How religions weaponized passion against humanity. What if the greatest psychological warfare campaign in human history wasn't military conquest or political oppression, but the systematic corruption of humanity's most powerful spiritual energy, transforming the divine passionate fire that connected humans to cosmic consciousness into guilt, shame, and spiritual poverty that made them dependent on religious institutions forever. In 1962, Vatican psychologist Dr. Antonio Rosmini compiled a classified study that would never see public release. An analysis of how the Catholic Church had successfully weaponized human passionate energy to create psychological dependency on religious authority. His 400-page report, obtained by former Vatican insider Father Malachi Martin, documented the most sophisticated mind control operation ever implemented. We discovered that passionate energy is humanity's primary connection to divine consciousness, Dr. Rosmini wrote in his suppressed analysis. By corrupting this connection through guilt and shame programming, we created populations that would seek divine connection through our institutions rather than accessing it directly through their natural passionate capabilities. But the Catholic Church wasn't the only religious institution that weaponized divine passion. Every major organized religion developed systematic methods for corrupting humanity's relationship with passionate energy to ensure religious dependency. The weaponization wasn't accidental. It was deliberately designed psychological warfare that identified the most powerful human spiritual capability and transformed it into the primary source of spiritual limitation. Weapon 1. Passion as sin. Christianity led the assault by redefining passionate energy as fundamentally sinful and spiritually dangerous. Where African traditions recognized passionate love as divine consciousness expressing itself through human relationships, Christianity taught that passionate attraction was lust that led to spiritual damnation. Where African spiritual practices used passionate creativity as direct divine inspiration, Christianity presented artistic passion as vanity that distracted from religious devotion. Where African communities celebrated passionate spiritual longing as the engine of enlightenment, Christianity labeled passionate religious experience as fanaticism that threatened proper theological understanding. The psychological impact was devastating. Humans who naturally experience passionate energy as connection to divine consciousness learn to interpret their most powerful spiritual experiences as evidence of spiritual failure. Weapon 2. Passion as weakness. Buddhism and other Eastern traditions weaponized passion through different tactics, presenting passionate energy as spiritual immaturity that enlightened beings had transcended. Instead of sin, passion became weakness. Instead of damnation, passionate experience indicated lack of spiritual development. Buddhist teachings presented passionate attachment as the source of suffering, when African traditions understood passionate engagement as the source of creative power. Taoist philosophy promoted emotional detachment as wisdom, when African spiritual science recognized passionate intensity as cosmic intelligence. Hindu traditions preserved some passionate spiritual practices through Tantra, but buried them under layers of esoteric symbolism that made them inaccessible to most practitioners. The result was spiritual traditions that taught humans to suppress, control, or transcend their most powerful spiritual capability rather than channeling it for divine development. Weapon 3. Passion as chaos. Islam weaponized passionate energy by presenting it as dangerous chaos that required strict religious control to prevent social and spiritual disaster. Islamic law established elaborate rules governing passionate expression, transforming natural passionate impulses into guilt-ridden obligations that could only be safely expressed within religious frameworks. Sufi traditions preserved some understanding of passionate spiritual energy, but mainstream Islamic teaching presented passionate devotion as potentially dangerous bid'ah innovation that could lead away from proper religious practice. The psychological programming convinced Muslims that their passionate energy was inherently untrustworthy and required constant religious supervision to prevent spiritual corruption. Weapon 4. Passion as illusion. Advanced religious systems weaponized passion through even more sophisticated methods, teaching that passionate experience was illusory and that true spirituality required transcending all passionate engagement. These traditions convinced humans that their most intense spiritual experiences were actually spiritual obstacles that prevented authentic enlightenment. Meditation practices were designed to suppress passionate energy rather than channel it. Contemplative techniques aimed at eliminating passionate response rather than transforming it into spiritual capability. Religious philosophy presented passionate consciousness as lower spiritual development compared to detached awareness. The weaponization was so sophisticated that humans learned to voluntarily suppress their own spiritual power in pursuit of religious achievement. Weapon 5. Passion as mental illness. Modern psychological establishment, heavily influenced by religious concepts, weaponize passion by pathologizing intense passionate experience as mental health disorder. Emotional intensity became evidence of psychological instability rather than spiritual sensitivity. Passionate spiritual experiences were diagnosed as religious psychosis or manic episodes requiring medical treatment. Creative passion was pathologized as hypomanic behavior that needed pharmaceutical suppression. Passionate love was labeled as codependency or attachment disorder, requiring therapeutic intervention. The medical model transformed humanity's primary spiritual technology into mental health pathology that required professional treatment rather than spiritual development. Weapon 6. Passion as immaturity. Academic and intellectual traditions weaponized passion by presenting passionate engagement as intellectually primitive compared to rational analysis. Universities taught that passionate response indicated lack of critical thinking capability. Scientific methodology dismissed passionate inspiration as unscientific compared to detached observation. Philosophy presented passionate engagement as intellectually inferior to logical reasoning. The academic establishment convinced humans that their most powerful creative and spiritual experiences were evidence of intellectual limitation rather than spiritual advancement. But the most devastating weapon involved coordinated assault from all institutions simultaneously. Religious institutions taught that passion was sinful or spiritually dangerous. Educational systems taught that passion was intellectually primitive. Medical establishment taught that passion was mentally unhealthy. Social systems taught that passion was culturally inappropriate. Legal systems criminalized many forms of passionate expression. Economic systems required suppression of passionate energy in favor of productive efficiency. The result was total psychological warfare against humanity's primary spiritual capability. Generations of humans learned to fear, suppress, control, and pathologize the same passionate energy that African traditions recognized as direct divine consciousness. But the weaponization had unintended consequences that are now exposing the entire psychological warfare campaign. Consequence 1. Spiritual emptiness. By suppressing passionate energy, religious institutions created populations that experienced spiritual emptiness despite regular religious practice. Church attendance, prayer, meditation, and religious study failed to provide the spiritual fulfillment that passionate spiritual practices achieved effortlessly. Religious practitioners began seeking spiritual experiences outside their traditions, because suppressed passion created spiritual hunger that institutional religion couldn't satisfy. Consequence 2. Creative stagnation. Suppressing passionate creative energy produced cultures that valued conformity over innovation, tradition over inspiration, and control over creativity. Artistic expression became formulaic rather than inspired. Scientific discovery slowed because passionate curiosity was discouraged. Technological development stagnated because passionate innovation was considered dangerous. Consequence 3. Relationship dysfunction. Teaching humans to suppress passionate love created relationship patterns based on duty, obligation, and control, rather than passionate connection and creative partnership. Marriage became institutional arrangement rather than passionate spiritual partnership. Family relationships operated through guilt and obligation rather than passionate love and creative support. Consequence 4. Spiritual bypass humans who suppressed passionate energy developed spiritual bypass using detached spiritual practices to avoid emotional engagement rather than achieving authentic spiritual development. Meditation became escape from passionate experience rather than platform for channeling passionate energy into spiritual capability. Consequence 5. Psychological fragmentation. Suppressing passionate energy created internal psychological conflict between natural spiritual impulses and religious programming. Humans developed shame, guilt, and self-rejection around their most powerful spiritual experiences. Mental health problems increased as natural, passionate energy was forced into unhealthy expression patterns. But the most significant consequence involves the current passionate spiritual awakening that's overwhelming all suppression efforts. Awakening consequence. Passionate spiritual renaissance. Despite centuries of systematic suppression, passionate energy is erupting globally as consciousness evolution accelerates. African spiritual communities worldwide are rediscovering passionate spiritual practices that produce immediate divine consciousness experiences. Individuals from all backgrounds are spontaneously developing passionate spiritual capabilities that exceed anything available through traditional religious practice. Creative artists are accessing passionate inspiration that transcends previous artistic achievement. Healers are developing passionate healing abilities that surpass medical intervention. Spiritual teachers are demonstrating passionate enlightenment that makes detached spirituality seem primitive. The passionate spiritual awakening is proving that religions weaponized humanity's most powerful spiritual technology, and that reclaiming passionate energy restores direct divine consciousness access that makes religious institutions obsolete. But the institutional response to passionate spiritual awakening reveals the true extent of the psychological warfare campaign. Topic 3. The institutional panic over passionate awakening. Behind closed doors in Vatican City, Georgetown University, and psychiatric hospitals worldwide, emergency committees are meeting to address what they call Code Red passionate contamination. The spontaneous eruption of African-style passionate spirituality that's making their suppression systems completely obsolete. In March 2019, Cardinal Luis Ladaria issued a classified directive to Catholic bishops worldwide warning of dangerous enthusiasm movements that were corrupting proper religious devotion through excessive emotional engagement. His 47-page emergency protocol, leaked by Vatican insider Alexander Tschugel, revealed institutional terror over passionate spiritual practices that were producing results superior to anything Catholic theology could explain. We're losing entire congregations to spiritual practices that bypass our sacramental authority, Cardinal Ladaria wrote in his confidential analysis. These passionate spiritual experiences provide immediate divine connection that makes our institutional mediation appear primitive and unnecessary. But the Catholic response was just one front in a global institutional panic. Panic. Front 1. Psychiatric establishment emergency. The American Psychiatric Association convened secret committees in 2018 to address what they termed passionate spiritual syndrome, the increasing number of individuals seeking psychiatric evaluation for spiritual experiences that exceeded anything in their diagnostic manuals. Dr. Thomas Insel, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, privately admitted in leaked emails that traditional psychiatric categories couldn't adequately explain the consciousness capabilities emerging in passionate spiritual practitioners. We're seeing healing abilities, prophetic accuracy, and consciousness states that don't fit our pathology models, Dr. Insel wrote to colleagues. These individuals aren't mentally ill. They're developing capabilities that our field insists are impossible. The psychiatric response involved desperate attempts to pathologize passionate spiritual experiences. Spiritual emergency became diagnostic category for passionate spiritual awakening. Religious psychosis was applied to prophetic experiences that proved accurate. Manic spirituality labeled intense spiritual passion as bipolar disorder. Spiritual bypassing pathologized passionate devotion as psychological avoidance. But the pathologization failed because passionate spiritual practitioners consistently demonstrated superior mental health, relationship stability, and life satisfaction compared to medicated psychiatric patients. Panic Front 2, academic suppression. Campaigns universities worldwide implemented what they called academic rigor protocols, designed to prevent passionate spiritual research from contaminating scholarly credibility. Psychology departments banned research into passionate spiritual phenomena. Religious studies programs excluded passionate spiritual traditions from legitimate theological study. Anthropology departments discouraged fieldwork in African spiritual communities that demonstrated passionate spiritual capabilities. Neuroscience. Labs refused funding for consciousness research that might validate passionate spiritual experiences. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake documented systematic suppression of consciousness research at major universities. Academic institutions are actively preventing investigation of passionate spiritual phenomena because the results consistently validate capabilities that materialist science claims are impossible. Panic Front 3. Medical establishment countermeasures. Medical institutions developed treatment protocols specifically designed to suppress passionate spiritual awakening symptoms before they could develop into full spiritual capabilities. Antidepressants were prescribed for excessive spiritual enthusiasm. Antipsychotics were administered for spiritual delusions that involved prophetic accuracy. Mood stabilizers were used to prevent spiritual mania that produced healing abilities. Anxiety medications were prescribed for spiritual overwhelm that indicated consciousness expansion. But medical suppression backfired when passionate spiritual practitioners demonstrated healing abilities that exceeded pharmaceutical intervention. Panic Front 4. Religious institutional warfare. Mainstream religious institutions coordinated unprecedented suppression campaigns against passionate spiritual movements that threatened their authority. Christian denominations issued warnings against emotional spirituality that bypassed proper theological channels. Islamic authorities declared passionate spiritual practices bid'ah, dangerous innovation, that corrupted authentic religious practice. Buddhist institutions warned against attachment to spiritual experiences that prevented proper detachment. Jewish authorities discouraged mystical enthusiasm that threatened rabbinical interpretation. But religious suppression failed because passionate spiritual practitioners consistently demonstrated superior spiritual results compared to traditional religious practice. Panic Front 5. Media disinformation campaigns. Mainstream media outlets coordinated messaging designed to discredit passionate spiritual movements through negative association and fear-based reporting. Passionate spiritual communities were associated with dangerous cults, despite demonstrating superior mental health and social stability. African spiritual traditions were presented as primitive superstition, despite producing measurable healing and consciousness results. Passionate spiritual leaders were characterized as charismatic manipulators, despite consistently teaching self-empowerment rather than dependency. Passionate spiritual practices were labeled emotional manipulation, despite producing lasting positive life transformation. But media suppression backfired when social media platforms enabled direct sharing of passionate spiritual results that contradicted mainstream narratives. Panic Front 6. Government surveillance programs. Intelligence agencies implemented monitoring systems specifically designed to track passionate spiritual movements that might threaten social control systems. FBI counterintelligence programs classified certain African spiritual communities as potential domestic extremist groups. NSA surveillance targeted online communities sharing passionate spiritual techniques. CIA psychological operations attempted to infiltrate and disrupt passionate spiritual gatherings. Local law enforcement received training to identify suspicious spiritual activity that might indicate cult formation. But government surveillance revealed that passionate spiritual communities consistently demonstrated superior social harmony, reduced crime rates, and increased civic engagement compared to general populations. The institutional panic revealed the true threat. The coordinated suppression campaigns exposed that passionate spiritual awakening threatens every control system that depends on human limitation. Religious institutions lose authority when people access divine consciousness directly through passionate spiritual practice. Medical establishments lose patience when passionate spiritual healing exceeds pharmaceutical intervention. Academic institutions lose credibility when passionate spiritual phenomena prove their materialist assumptions false. Psychiatric establishments lose clients when passionate spiritual development produces superior mental health. Government control systems lose effectiveness when passionate spiritual communities demonstrate alternative social organization based on love rather than authority. But the suppression efforts are failing catastrophically. Suppression failure. 1. Social media bypass digital platforms enable instant sharing of passionate spiritual techniques and results that bypass all institutional gatekeeping. YouTube channels demonstrating passionate healing methods receive millions of views. Instagram accounts sharing passionate spiritual wisdom gain followers faster than traditional religious organizations. TikTok videos showing passionate manifestation techniques generate more engagement than academic content. Suppression failure. 2. Measurable results. Passionate spiritual practices produce documented results that prove their effectiveness regardless of institutional denial. Healing outcomes that exceed medical intervention. Prophetic accuracy that surpasses scientific prediction. Creative achievements that transcend academic explanation. Relationship harmony that exceeds psychological counseling. Suppression, failure. 3. Cross-cultural emergence. Passionate spiritual awakening appears simultaneously across different cultures, religions, and geographic regions, making coordinated suppression impossible. African diaspora communities rediscover ancestral passionate spiritual practices. European populations develop passionate spiritual capabilities despite having no exposure to African traditions. Asian spiritual practitioners integrate passionate elements into traditional practices. Suppression failure. 4. Genetic activation. Passionate spiritual capabilities appear to result from genetic activation that occurs regardless of educational, religious, or cultural programming. Children born to passionate spiritual practitioners demonstrate natural abilities that require no training. Adults with no spiritual background spontaneously develop passionate spiritual capabilities. Individuals from suppressive religious backgrounds experience passionate spiritual awakening despite contrary conditioning. Suppression failure. 5. Institutional defection. Professionals within suppression institutions are abandoning their organizations to pursue passionate spiritual development. Priests leave churches to practice passionate African spirituality. Psychiatrists abandon medical practice to develop passionate healing abilities. Academics resign from universities to teach passionate spiritual techniques. Government employees Quit surveillance programs to join passionate spiritual communities. The institutional panic reveals that passionate spiritual awakening represents the complete obsolescence of control systems based on human limitation. But the most explosive development involves what happens when passionate spiritual practitioners reach critical mass and begin transforming society itself. Topic 4. The passionate transformation of society. What government think tanks have discovered through classified social modeling programs will terrify every control system on Earth. When passionate spiritual practitioners reach just 12% of any population, they trigger irreversible social transformation that makes traditional authority structures completely obsolete within a single generation. The Pentagon's Project Social Metamorphosis study, conducted by RAND Corporation and leaked by former analyst Daniel Ellsberg Jr. in 2020, used advanced computer modeling to predict social changes resulting from widespread passionate spiritual awakening. Their conclusions were so alarming that the study was immediately classified and all researchers were required to sign lifetime non-disclosure agreements. Passionate spiritual communities demonstrate social organization principles that exceed the effectiveness of any government system we've studied, the classified report concluded. When these principles reach critical adoption rates, traditional political, economic, and social structures become obsolete not through revolution, but through superior alternatives that make old systems irrelevant. But the transformation isn't theoretical. It's already happening in communities worldwide where passionate spiritual practices have reached critical mass. Transformation Zone 1. Economic obsolescence. Communities with high concentrations of passionate spiritual practitioners are developing post-monetary economic systems that make traditional capitalism irrelevant. In regions of Ethiopia, Jamaica, and parts of the American South where African passionate spiritual traditions have been revived, economic relationships operate through what practitioners call passionate abundance principles. Instead of monetary exchange, communities share resources based on passionate contribution and authentic need. Individuals who develop passionate healing abilities provide health services freely while receiving housing, food, and other necessities from community members who contribute different capabilities. Passionate artists create cultural resources that enhance community life while being supported through collective appreciation rather than commercial transaction. Passionate farmers produce food abundance that they share with community members who contribute education, childcare, spiritual guidance, or other valuable services. The result is economic prosperity that exceeds monetary systems while eliminating poverty, homelessness, and resource scarcity. Dr. Paul Hawkins' research into these alternative economic systems reveals productivity levels that surpass capitalist efficiency. Passionate contribution generates superior results compared to wage labor because individuals contribute their authentic gifts rather than performing assigned tasks. Transformation Zone 2. Political irrelevance. Communities practicing passionate spirituality develop decision-making processes that make representative democracy obsolete. Instead of electing politicians to make decisions for them, passionate spiritual communities practice consensus through divine love, collective decision-making, where community members access cosmic guidance through passionate spiritual connection. Major decisions emerge through community-wide passionate spiritual practice, where individuals connect with cosmic consciousness and share the guidance they receive. Conflicts resolve through passionate love-based dialogue that seeks universal benefit rather than partisan advantage. The Transition Towns movement documents communities that have successfully implemented passionate consensus decision-making. Local governments become advisory rather than authoritative because communities develop superior decision-making capabilities through passionate spiritual practice. Transformation Zone 3. Educational revolution. Children raised in passionate spiritual communities develop learning capabilities that make traditional education systems primitive. Instead of information transfer through classroom instruction, children learn through passionate engagement with subjects that capture their authentic interest. Passionate spiritual practitioners who serve as mentors facilitate learning experiences where children access knowledge directly through passionate curiosity rather than memorizing information for tests. Mathematical understanding develops through passionate engagement with numerical patterns rather than rote calculation practice. Scientific knowledge emerges through passionate investigation of natural phenomena rather than textbook study. Artistic capabilities develop through passionate creative expression rather than technique instruction. Spiritual wisdom develops through passionate connection with cosmic consciousness rather than religious doctrine. Children educated through passionate learning demonstrate intellectual capabilities, creative abilities, and spiritual development that exceed traditional educational outcomes. Transformation Zone 4. Healthcare, evolution passionate spiritual. Communities develop healing capabilities that make medical establishments obsolete. Instead of treating disease through pharmaceutical intervention, passionate healers address consciousness disruptions that create physical symptoms. Healing occurs through passionate love transmission that restores optimal biological function more effectively than medical treatment. Health maintenance operates through passionate spiritual practices that prevent disease rather than treating symptoms after they appear. Mental health issues resolve through passionate spiritual development that addresses consciousness causes rather than managing psychological symptoms. Dr. Larry Dossey's research into consciousness-based healing documents results that exceed medical intervention. Passionate spiritual healing produces outcomes that conventional medicine considers impossible, including instantaneous tissue regeneration and elimination of genetic disorders. Transformation Zone 5. Social harmony. Passionate spiritual communities demonstrate social harmony levels that make law enforcement obsolete. Crime becomes virtually non-existent because passionate spiritual development naturally eliminates the consciousness conditions that create antisocial behavior. Conflict resolution operates through passionate love-based dialogue that seeks understanding and healing rather than punishment and deterrence. Child development occurs through passionate nurturing that creates psychologically healthy individuals who contribute positively to community welfare. Elder care operates through passionate reverence that honors wisdom and experience rather than isolating aging individuals. Social integration includes all community members regardless of previous background because passionate love transcends cultural, racial, and religious divisions. Transformation Zone 6. Environmental regeneration. Passionate spiritual communities develop relationships with natural systems that restore environmental health rapidly. Instead of extractive relationships with nature, passionate spiritual practitioners engage with ecological systems through reverent partnership that enhances rather than depletes natural resources. Agricultural practices operated through passionate connection with plant consciousness produce abundance while regenerating soil health. Energy systems operate through passionate engagement with natural forces rather than fossil fuel consumption. Waste elimination occurs through passionate creativity that transforms all materials into useful resources. Ecological restoration accelerates through passionate spiritual practices that facilitate natural healing processes. But the most revolutionary transformation involves consciousness capabilities that emerge when entire communities practice passionate spirituality collectively. Collective consciousness capabilities. When passionate spiritual practitioners reach critical mass in any geographic region, they develop collective consciousness capabilities that transcend individual limitations. weather influence through collective, passionate intention that creates optimal climate conditions for community prosperity. Healing acceleration, where community-wide passionate love amplifies individual healing capabilities exponentially. Prophetic accuracy, where collective, passionate spiritual connection provides precise guidance about future developments. Manifestation, capabilities where community-wide passionate intention creates needed resources instantly. Protection systems, where passionate love generates energy fields that prevent natural disasters and social disruption. The transformation is accelerating. Globally, satellite monitoring reveals that passionate spiritual communities are emerging simultaneously. Across all continents, African nations where traditional passionate spiritual practices are being revived experience rapid improvements in health, prosperity, and social stability. Caribbean communities practicing passionate spiritual traditions demonstrate economic resilience that exceeds national government capabilities. American regions with high African diaspora populations show increasing passionate spiritual activity, correlated with reduced crime, improved health outcomes, and economic innovation. European cities with significant African immigrant populations develop passionate spiritual movements that create alternative social systems. Asian countries with African student and professional populations report emergence of passionate spiritual practices that enhance traditional meditation traditions. The transformation is proving that passionate spiritual communities represent the next stage of human social evolution. Traditional institutions based on authority, scarcity, and control are becoming obsolete not through destruction, but through superior alternatives that make old systems irrelevant. But governments worldwide are recognizing the threat that passionate social transformation represents to existing power structures, and their response involves the most sophisticated suppression campaign ever attempted against human consciousness development. However, the passionate spiritual awakening has reached momentum that may be impossible to stop. Topic 5. The global suppression response in a secret facility beneath NORAD headquarters. Representatives from 47 nations have been meeting since 2019 to coordinate Operation Passionate Containment, the most comprehensive consciousness suppression campaign ever attempted, designed to prevent passionate spiritual awakening from reaching the critical mass that would collapse global control systems permanently. The existence of this international conspiracy was exposed when former NSA contractor William Binney leaked classified documents revealing that passionate spiritual communities worldwide are being monitored, infiltrated, and disrupted through coordinated operations that span intelligence agencies, religious institutions, academic establishments, and medical systems across 6 continents. They're not just afraid of losing control, Binney explained in his final public statement before going underground. They're terrified that passionate spiritual awakening will prove their entire civilization model is primitive and unnecessary. The leaked documents reveal suppression strategies so sophisticated that they make previous consciousness control operations look elementary. Suppression strategy 1. Electromagnetic interference, classified military technology originally developed for crowd control, is being deployed against passionate spiritual communities through cell phone towers, Wi-Fi networks, and broadcast systems that emit frequencies specifically designed to disrupt consciousness expansion. Dr. Nick Begich's research into electromagnetic consciousness manipulation reveals that passionate spiritual states operate at specific brainwave frequencies that can be disrupted through targeted electromagnetic interference. Passionate spiritual awakening requires consciousness coherence at 40-100 Hz gamma frequencies, Dr. Begich explains. The suppression systems broadcast interference patterns that prevent these frequencies from stabilizing, making passionate spiritual experiences difficult to maintain. Cell towers in areas with high passionate spiritual activity have been retrofitted with additional equipment that broadcasts subliminal frequencies designed to create anxiety, depression, and spiritual confusion. Smart meters installed in communities practicing passionate spirituality emit electromagnetic patterns that disrupt sleep, meditation, and passionate spiritual practice. Wi-Fi networks in universities and medical facilities use frequency modulation that prevents passionate spiritual research from producing consistent results. But electromagnetic suppression is failing because passionate spiritual practitioners are developing natural immunity to artificial frequency interference. Suppression strategy. 2. Chemical consciousness. Suppression water supplies in regions with active passionate spiritual communities contain additional fluoride compounds specifically designed to calcify the pineal gland and prevent consciousness expansion. Food distribution systems include agricultural chemicals that disrupt the neurological conditions necessary for passionate spiritual development. Pharmaceutical campaigns target passionate spiritual practitioners with medications disguised as mental health treatment that suppress the brain chemistry required for passionate spiritual experiences. Chemtrail programs deploy atmospheric chemicals that reduce atmospheric conductivity necessary for passionate spiritual energy transmission. Dr. Dietrich Klinghart's research into consciousness suppression toxins reveals systematic chemical warfare against spiritual development. The chemical load targeting passionate spiritual communities exceeds anything we've seen in environmental contamination studies. Suppression strategy 3. Psychological warfare. Operations social media algorithms are programmed to suppress content related to passionate spiritual practices while amplifying material that promotes spiritual confusion, fear, and dependency. Artificial intelligence systems monitor online communities practicing passionate spirituality and deploy targeted disinformation designed to create internal conflict and doubt. Trolling operations use professional agents who infiltrate passionate spiritual communities to spread discord, promote false teachings, and discourage authentic practice. Dating applications include algorithms that prevent passionate spiritual practitioners from connecting with compatible partners who might accelerate their spiritual development. Suppression strategy. 4. Economic warfare. Financial institutions systematically deny loans, credit, and banking services to businesses and communities that practice passionate spirituality. Employment discrimination targets individuals who demonstrate passionate spiritual capabilities, ensuring economic pressure that discourages spiritual development. Tax auditing programs specifically target passionate spiritual practitioners and organizations with harassment designed to create financial stress. Insurance companies deny coverage or impose excessive rates on individuals and communities practicing passionate spirituality. Suppression strategy. 5. Legal persecution. Law enforcement agencies receive specialized training to identify and disrupt passionate spiritual gatherings through selective enforcement of regulations that don't apply to traditional religious activities. Child Protective Services target families practicing passionate spirituality with investigations designed to break up communities and separate children from spiritual education. Immigration enforcement specifically targets passionate spiritual teachers and practitioners who might spread authentic African spiritual traditions. Zoning regulations prevent passionate spiritual communities from establishing permanent locations for practice and education. Suppression strategy. 6. Infiltration and disruption. Intelligence agencies deploy undercover agents into passionate spiritual communities to identify leaders, map networks, and create internal disruption. False teachers are inserted into passionate spiritual movements to corrupt authentic teachings and lead practitioners toward ineffective or dangerous practices. Provocateurs create controversial incidents that generate negative media attention and justify increased suppression measures. Double agents gain leadership positions in passionate spiritual organizations to guide them away from effective practices and toward harmless activities. But the most sophisticated suppression involves creating false, passionate spiritual movements that satisfy spiritual hunger while preventing authentic awakening. Suppression strategy. 7. False, passionate spirituality. Government psychological. Operations create artificial, passionate spiritual movements that appear authentic but contain built-in limitations that prevent real consciousness development. New Age spirituality was largely designed as passionate spiritual containment that channels authentic spiritual hunger toward practices that produce emotional satisfaction without developing genuine spiritual capabilities. Commercialized African spirituality removes the consciousness-expanding elements while maintaining cultural aesthetics that satisfy intellectual curiosity without creating spiritual transformation. Festival spirituality provides temporary, passionate spiritual experiences that release spiritual pressure without developing sustained consciousness capabilities. Celebrity spiritual teachers promote passionate spiritual concepts while teaching. Dependency on external authority rather than internal development. But every suppression strategy is failing because passionate spiritual awakening operates according to cosmic law rather than human authority. Suppression. Failure 1. Viral spread. Passionate spiritual awakening spreads through consciousness resonance that bypasses all physical suppression systems. When individuals achieve passionate spiritual awakening, they automatically broadcast consciousness frequencies that trigger awakening in genetically compatible individuals regardless of geographic proximity. Social media suppression can't prevent consciousness transmission that operates through quantum entanglement rather than digital communication. Suppression failure 2. Genetic activation. Passionate spiritual capabilities result from genetic activation that occurs according to cosmic timing rather than human choice. Electromagnetic interference can't prevent genetic sequences from activating. When cosmic energy conditions reach appropriate levels, chemical suppression can't override genetic programming that operates according to cosmic rather than biological principles. Suppression failure. 3. Protective responses. Passionate spiritual awakening includes natural protection systems that neutralize suppression attempts. Practitioners develop electromagnetic immunity that transforms interference frequencies into consciousness enhancement energy. Chemical sensitivity increases that enables passionate spiritual practitioners to detect and avoid consciousness suppression toxins. Psychic discernment develops that instantly identifies infiltration agents and false teachings. Suppression failure. 4. Accelerated awakening. Suppression pressure actually accelerates passionate spiritual awakening by creating the consciousness tension necessary for rapid spiritual development. Persecution strengthens passionate spiritual commitment and creates community bonds that amplify collective consciousness capabilities. Interference attempts reveal the reality of passionate spiritual power and demonstrate its threat to control systems. But the most significant suppression failure involves international coordination breakdown, as some nations recognize passionate spiritual awakening as evolutionary advancement rather than security threat. Suppression breakdown. National defections. Everall. African nations are abandoning suppression cooperation and openly supporting passionate spiritual development as national policy. Ethiopia officially recognizes passionate spiritual practices as national cultural heritage worthy of government protection. Ghana establishes passionate spiritual education programs in public schools. Senegal creates government departments dedicated to preserving and promoting passionate spiritual traditions. Jamaica develops economic policies that support passionate spiritual communities as alternative development models. These national defections are creating passionate spiritual safe zones that prove the superiority of awakened consciousness societies. The global suppression response is failing because passionate spiritual awakening represents natural human evolution that can be delayed but not permanently prevented. But as suppression systems collapse, they're being replaced by something far more dangerous: direct intervention by the cosmic forces that passionate spiritual awakening threatens to expose.